Jackson Montgomery always knew where he wanted to go. Ever since he was 22, when he got his first job at a mid-sized brokerage firm in Manhattan, he had made control his religion. Nothing escaped his calculations. The exact time he went to the gym, the ideal price for a stock to rise before selling, the right tone of voice when negotiating with shareholders. At 53, he occupied an entire floor in one of the most expensive buildings on Wall Street, ran billion-dollar funds, and was respected even by those who feared him. But on that cloudy March morning, standing in front of the dark wooden coffin, he felt that everything he had built had become irrelevant. Eleanor, his wife of 20 years, his steadying point and silent harbor, had suddenly passed away after a massive aneurysm, and Jackson, who thought he had the answer to everything, now found himself faced with the one question he never imagined he would have to face. How do you go on living when the only part of your life that really mattered is gone? Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to the channel. There are many real and transformative stories like this coming up, and you won't want to miss them. The hall where the wake was being held was filled with white flowers and well-dressed people exchanging polite greetings and uncomfortable glances. But Jackson couldn't hear a thing. The noises were all muffled inside, as if a bubble separated him from the world. He only came back to reality when, looking at the door at the back of the chapel, he saw 3 girls watching in silence. They were lined up, holding hands, their brown hair flowing down their shoulders as if it had been combed by someone careful. Their eyes were attentive, and they had an unusual serenity for children their age. What disconcerted him most was the resemblance between them, not only to each other, but to someone he had known a long time ago. It was impossible to explain logically, but there was something about them that made him feel a sharp pang in his stomach, as if a mirror of a forgotten life had been placed before him. Before he could approach them, the girls disappeared through the door, leaving behind a sense of unease that Jackson would carry with him for the next few days. Jackson tried to move on with his life in the days that followed, but there was something about the girls that wouldn't leave his mind. Their faces came back to him with an almost irritating clarity. It wasn't just the resemblance between them, but the way one of them, the one in the middle, had looked at him for a few seconds. It was as if she knew him. This bothered him more than he cared to admit. He, who had always prided himself on the relentless logic and rationality that guided his decisions, now found himself consulting the driver about something that, in other times, he would have classified as daydreaming. Thomas, his trusted employee for more than 15 years, listened to the request with a surprised expression but didn't question it. He simply nodded, started the car, and that same afternoon, he discreetly went to investigate who the 3 silent little visitors to the funeral were. 2 days later, Thomas returned with information that Jackson was not prepared to hear. The girls were named Harper, Haley, and Hannah Wilson, and they lived with their Aunt Charlotte in a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn. They had lost their mother, Meredith, 3 months earlier to leukemia. Meredith. The name was like a punch. It took Jackson a few seconds to respond. It was impossible to forget that name. She had been his intense and brief passion almost 2 decades earlier, at a time when he still believed that success required personal sacrifices. And she, not accepting being part of a plan B, left without looking back. Jackson never knew that she had gotten pregnant, or rather, he had never even considered the possibility. Thomas hesitated before handing over the worn envelope that his Aunt Charlotte kept among Meredith's documents. Inside was a letter, and in it everything that Jackson had not expected, but perhaps deep down, deserved to find out. Jackson didn't open the letter right away. He spent more than an hour with the envelope between his fingers, sitting in the leather office chair that had always been the symbol of his stability. The sound of the cars outside, muffled by the double-glazed windows, contrasted with the whirlwind that was forming inside him. That handwriting, firm but delicate, seemed frozen in time. When he finally found the courage, his hands were shaking more than he would have liked. The letter began directly, without flourishes. "If you're reading this, it's because I'm no longer here." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. As he read, Meredith's voice seemed to fill the space, vivid, courageous, but with a trace of sorrow that he recognized. She spoke about her daughters, about how she chose to raise them without the shadow of an absent father, about how she chose not to look for him because she believed he wouldn't have room in his life for something as chaotic as 3 girls. The letter was undemanding. There was no vengeance, no apology. It was just honest. Meredith said that her daughters had grown up loved, that Charlotte had been a steady and present figure, but that none of them knew who their father was. "Maybe one day you will know them, maybe you won't. But if that day comes, please don't hurt what I have spent years building with such care." That last sentence echoed in Jackson's head for days. He read the letter over and over, always coming back to it. There was no demand, but there was a warning. And for the first time in years, Jackson felt afraid that he wouldn't measure up. It was a new, uncomfortable, almost childish feeling, but at the same time, there was a spark he couldn't ignore, a kind of impulse that came from a place he had never explored before, a genuine desire to make amends, or at least try. The first time Jackson saw the girls up close was on a sunny Saturday in front of the ballet school where Thomas had discovered they had weekly classes. He parked his car across the street and waited. He wasn't sure what he would do if he saw them. Part of him wanted to run across, introduce himself, tell them everything at once. But something stronger held him back. When the door opened and the 3 of them emerged, wearing lavender leotards and with their hair pulled back in messy buns, he froze. Harper walked in front, holding the other 2's backpacks with an air of precocious responsibility. Haley looked around critically, as if silently assessing the movement on the street. And Hannah, the youngest, twirled on the sidewalk by herself, as if dancing for herself. Jackson found himself smiling without realizing it. For the first time in a long time, he felt something like lightness. And for the first time in his life, he realized what it was like to see a part of himself existing outside of his control. Are you enjoying the story? Then leave a like on the video. This will help more people find and be moved by this content too. That very day, he made a decision. He wouldn't tell them who he was. Not yet. First, he needed to understand who they were. He needed to deserve to be there. And so he began to visit the places they visited, always from a distance, always respecting their boundaries. Little by little, he began to gain small opportunities. He bought books. At the school fair, discreetly donated to a neighborhood campaign, and started going to the coffee shop where Charlotte had coffee with them on Sundays, all without announcing himself. It was there, in that simple, everyday environment, that he began to discover the beauty of routine. He realized that he didn't need a helicopter or a reservation at a 3-star Michelin restaurant to have a valuable experience. Sometimes all it took was watching Hannah slip 4 packets of sugar into her juice, without Charlotte noticing, or noticing Haley correcting her sister with an almost comical seriousness. Jackson was learning, slowly, silently, and for the first time, with his heart in command. The first direct interaction happened almost by chance. Hannah dropped a book as she was leaving the cafeteria and, upon realizing it, ran back to pick it up, but another pair of hands got there first. Jackson bent down, handed over the copy and smiled. "Do you like Babette?" he asked, reading the crumpled cover of a children's book about a ballerina who dreams of flying. Hannah nodded, wide-eyed, surprised by the question. "She's my favorite, even when everyone says she can't." The answer, naive and powerful, stayed with Jackson for the rest of the day. He didn't know what to say next, just waved and walked away before Charlotte or the other girls noticed anything strange. But that moment planted something. From then on, Hannah began to greet him with a shy wave whenever she saw him. Then came Haley, who approached him one day suspiciously, asking if he was some kind of friend of Aunt Charlotte's. And finally, Harper, who had been watching everything carefully, took the longest, but eventually allowed a whispered "hi" with her head. Jackson knew he was entering delicate territory, and so he proceeded with extreme caution. One false step, and he could lose any opportunity. So he began to make himself present in small moments. He would help with a math question when Charlotte was struggling, suggest books at the local library, show up at school presentations as just another family acquaintance. Without realizing it, he had become someone who was part of the landscape of their lives, and this was changing him. He had previously spent his time dividing his time between spreadsheets and time zones, but now found himself memorizing recital dates, learning the names of his school friends, and understanding the difference between a point shoe and a demi-point shoe. At night, when he returned to his quiet apartment, Jackson no longer felt proud of closing a good deal. He felt proud of the memory of Hannah running up to him with a chalk drawing saying, "Thanks for coming." Over time, Charlotte began to notice Jackson's constant presence. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. He was in the same cafeteria, at the same school event, in the same library. But Charlotte wasn't naive. When she finally approached him, she was direct. "Why are you always around?" she asked, frowning and crossing her arms, as if she had already made up her mind. Jackson didn't try to dodge. They sat on a park bench, the children distracted by a cotton candy vendor, and he told her the truth. No beating around the bush. He talked about Meredith, about the past, about the letter. He talked about his bad choices, his absence, his desire, late but genuine, to be a part of the girls' lives. Charlotte listened in silence, her eyes welling up, but her weakness never betrayed. When he finished, she was silent for a few seconds before saying, "You can't break what I've spent years trying to keep together. If you're going to stay, stay for real. But know that they don't need a hero. They need someone who will stay." That conversation changed everything. Charlotte, reluctant but pragmatic, allowed Jackson to get closer to her more freely, but always with caution, always with limits. She watched him like a watchful lioness, and he respected that. He started picking up the girls from school on alternate days, started having lunch with them every now and then, and even helped them build a model of the solar system using styrofoam balls and paint that stained their hands as if it were an initiation ritual. It was in this process that Jackson realized how much absence had made him ignorant of what really mattered. He learned the difference between being present and just showing up. He discovered that Haley didn't like sweets, but loved Sudoku, that Harper hid behind responsibility so as not to show sadness, and that Hannah, small and intense, would ask difficult questions at the most unexpected moments, as if testing the world with words. One Sunday, during a walk in the park, Hannah tripped over a tree root and fell hard. It wasn't a serious injury, but her crying was intense and filled with more than physical pain. Jackson ran, knelt beside her, and instinctively took her in his arms. She couldn't resist. She buried her face in his chest and cried until she was sobbing. When she finally calmed down, she stared at his shirt, now stained with dirt and tears, and whispered, "You smell just like the dream I have sometimes." Jackson stood still. That sentence, spoken with such innocence, completely disarmed him. It wasn't about the smell, he understood. It was about the presence. It was about the place he was beginning to occupy in the unconscious of a child who didn't know it, but felt it, and that hit him harder than any free-fall graph ever had. From that day on, Jackson began to allow himself to feel. He started leaving the office early, canceling meetings that he had previously considered unavoidable. He renovated the apartment, replacing the cold furniture with pieces with history, and created a room for each girl, even if they didn't know it yet. He decorated everything with details that he observed in their small gestures: mystery books for Haley, a ballerina-shaped lamp for Hannah, an organized desk with dividers for Harper. He was learning to love in a practical, concrete way without having to say much. And curiously, it was in the small actions that he noticed the biggest changes within himself. Impatience gave way to listening. The need for control gave way to improvisation. For the first time in years, Jackson felt like he was building something that could not be bought, sold, or analyzed on a spreadsheet. He was simply living. There was one day when everything seemed to fall into place, albeit subtly. It was the night of the school's winter recital, and the three girls were to perform together in a dance called 3 Seasons. Jackson arrived early, took a seat in the middle row, and waited with a sense of anticipation he had never felt before, even on the largest trading floors of the stock exchange. When the lights dimmed and the music began, he watched his daughters walk onto the stage with the ease of people carrying more than just rehearsed steps. It was as if each of them was dancing their own pain, their own longing, and at the same time, a small sense of hope. Harper was the autumn, steady and collected. Haley was the winter, calculated and elegant. And Hannah was the spring, explosive and full of life. When they finished, applause filled the auditorium, but Jackson could barely clap. His eyes were watering and his hands were shaking. At that moment, he knew he would never be able to leave again. After the show, as they took pictures and celebrated with colorful cupcakes, Harper, who called him aside, she had an envelope in her hand and her eyes fixed on the floor. "We made this for school, but I wanted you to read it too," she said, handing him a text titled, "My Favorite Place in the World." Jackson read it right there, under the yellow light of the hallway. Harper described a place that was not physical, but a feeling. She talked about feeling safe when someone remembered her favorite color, when someone knew what she couldn't say out loud, and she concluded by saying that sometimes your favorite place can be a person. When he finished, Jackson bent down and carefully hugged his daughter. She didn't resist or shy away. She just rested her face on his shoulder, as if this moment had been a long time coming. Over the next few months, Jackson's presence became so constant that it stopped causing any surprise. The girls naturally included him in their weekend plans, in their schoolwork, in the improvised dinners with pasta and tomato sauce that always ended in laughter and flour in someone's hair. He learned to cook Haley's favorite dish, savory pancakes with cottage cheese and sun-dried tomatoes, even though he hated cheese. He discovered that Hannah was afraid of the dark, but that she slept peacefully if she heard the sound of rain, which led him to install a speaker with a playlist of storms in her room. And he learned, a day before everyone else, that Harper wanted to surprise Aunt Charlotte for her birthday by hand-sewing a pillow with her initials on it. Jackson helped, sewed along, messed up the stitches, pricked his finger, and didn't complain. For the first time, the discomfort made sense. But despite the growing affection, none of them still called him father, and he never demanded it. He knew that this title carried a weight that was not earned by presence but by construction. And it was by respecting this time, this silence, that Jackson began to understand a new form of love, one that does not demand, does not force, just remains, a love that does not need to be named to exist. Charlotte also began to let her guard down. She began to entrust him with small messages, ask for help with the girls' commitments, and even invite him to school meetings that she previously faced alone. Little by little, that man who had once been a cold and absent executive was being rewritten, not with speeches or elaborate plans, but with small daily actions, active listening, a sincere willingness to be a part of it. And every night that he closed the door to their bedroom after a goodnight kiss, Jackson felt something that he still could not name, but that filled exactly the void that Eleanor had left. One Saturday afternoon, while sorting through an old toy box at Charlotte's house, Haley found a yellowed photo of a younger Meredith, smiling serenely and holding her belly with a protective hand. The three girls approached, curious. "Mommy was pregnant here, right?" Hannah asked, turning the photo sideways. Charlotte hesitated for a second, but was honest. "Yes, it was right before you were born." It was Haley who broke the silence that followed. "She looks happy, but lonely." The sentence hung in the air like an uncomfortable truth. Jackson, who was helping stack books in another corner of the room, stopped what he was doing and watched from afar. The image struck him as a memory and a debt at the same time. There was no need to say anything. The connection between the girls and what they were beginning to suspect became clearer by the day, and he knew the moment of truth was approaching. On the way home that day, Haley got in the car, buckled up, and sped off, as if she'd been mulling over the question for hours. "Did you know our mother?" Jackson swallowed hard. His gaze in the rearview mirror met hers, steady, direct, but not aggressive. He nodded slowly. "Yes, a long time ago." Her answer was followed by a thick silence, broken only by the sound of the turn signal at the intersection. Harper, sitting in the seat next to him, looked out the window and said in a near whisper, "Did you like each other?" Jackson wasn't lying. "Yes, very much." No one answered. But that night, as he was helping Hannah brush her teeth, she suddenly turned and asked, "So that's why you look like us?" The toothbrush nearly fell out of his hand. This was the first time anyone had verbalized what they were all beginning to feel, and he knew the revelation wouldn't come from a formal conversation. It was already happening piece by piece. In the days that followed, the girls continued with their indirect questions, as if they were testing the waters before taking the next step. Harper began to observe him more intently, as if trying to fit the pieces of a silent puzzle together. Haley, in her logical way, began to take notes about his routine, the car he drove, the watch he wore, even the flavors of tea he preferred. Hannah, as always, said nothing, but hugged him for longer than necessary, with her eyes closed, as if trying to capture a scent, a sensation. Jackson didn't pressure them. He let each one follow their own pace. But inside, he lived on a tightrope between the relief of being close and the fear of losing everything with one wrong word. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was loaded with meaning, and he knew that sooner or later the truth would stop being a suspicion and become confirmation. It was on a normal afternoon, after school, that the subject finally came to light. The four of them were on the couch, watching a movie, when Haley paused the TV, turned to Jackson, and said directly, "You're our dad, right?" Jackson looked at Charlotte, who just nodded slightly. He took a deep breath and answered, "Yes." The three girls were silent for a few seconds. Harper bit her lip. Hannah looked at her lap, and Haley kept her eyes fixed on him. "Why didn't you tell me before?" the oldest asked, with a tone more curious than accusatory. "Because I was afraid of not being ready, afraid of not being good enough for you." The answer came sincerely, without dramatization, and maybe that was why it worked. The girls didn't run to hug him, nor did they cry, but they didn't leave either. They stayed, and in that moment, the fact that they stayed said more than any words. In the days following the revelation, the routine continued, but with a new weight, a new presence in the air. The girls didn't radically change their behavior, but small gestures began to emerge. Harper began calling him Jay, with a disguised smile, as if testing the sound of a nickname before deciding whether to change it to Dad. Haley handed him, without warning, a drawing of the four of them at a dinner table, each with their name and him identified as our dad in beta version. And Hannah, without ceremony one night at bedtime, simply said, "Good night, Daddy," and rolled over on her side as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It took Jackson minutes to leave the room. He cried quietly in the hallway, leaning against the wall, trying to understand how such a short word could carry so much. Charlotte, realizing that the girls were gradually accepting him, also relaxed. They began to share responsibilities more organically and even started having quick meetings on Sunday nights to plan the week. Who would pick up who would take them to the doctor, who would help with which project. It was all far from perfect, but it was real. Jackson, who had previously stood out for managing funds and stocks with a firm hand, now found himself negotiating who would choose the music for the car or who would get the last chocolate cupcake, and he found himself happy about it. It was as if each small family decision was worth more than any shareholder meeting. He still kept his job, still had important commitments, but his outlook was no longer the same, and everyone around him noticed. Even his office colleagues commented that Jackson seemed less tough, more human. He smiled, but he didn't explain it. He knew it wasn't something that could be explained. It was something that could only be experienced. Little by little, Jackson began to include more of his world in the girls' lives. He took them to see his office, now more colorful, with drawings of them pasted on the side of the monitor. He showed them where he worked, how the financial market worked, and even taught Hannah how to use an old HP calculator, which she found magical. Harper was interested in the charts. Haley asked for a book on investing. He realized that he didn't need to hide who he was. He just needed to translate his universe so that they could connect. And the most surprising thing was that they, despite being so different, were curious about everything. Each in their own way wanted to be part of what had previously been a distant and impersonal world. And Jackson, who had previously protected his spaces like fortresses, now opened each door with gusto, because there was finally someone to share it with. Christmas that year was different from all the others. For the first time, Jackson didn't travel. He cancelled his traditional stay in the Swiss Alps and spent the days wrapping paper, improvising recipes, and making handmade decorations made with hot glue and too much glitter. They put up the tree together, hung the stockings on the fireplace, and even built a nativity scene with clay figures, each with a different hair color. Charlotte was moved to see the girls so light-hearted. Jackson was too. It was as if the grief, once so heavy, had been embraced in a new way, transformed into something that united instead of separating. During dinner, Harper made an unexpected toast. She raised her glass of juice and said, "To the things we thought we had lost, but were just waiting for the right time to come back." Silence. Charlotte cried. Hannah clapped. And Jackson, for the first time, felt that he didn't need anything more than that moment. With the turn of the year, Jackson decided to do something symbolic. He rented a small house by the sea to spend a week together, away from routine, away from commitments, just the five of them. It was a simple building, made of light wood and large windows, with a smell of the sea and walls that creaked in the wind. The girls loved the place, especially Hannah, who ran through the rooms inventing names for each space, like the dream room or the courage room. They spent the days building sandcastles, playing board games, and eating leisurely meals. Charlotte laughed more than usual and even allowed herself to nap in a hammock while the girls and Jackson had a picnic in the backyard. It was as if time there had a different rhythm, slower, more sincere, more full of presence. One afternoon, while they were sitting on the sand watching the sunset, Harper started a conversation. "Mum used to come here with us, once a year." Jackson looked out at the sea, feeling the weight and beauty of that coincidence. "She said this was where she could breathe better," Haley added. Hannah, her eyes fixed on the horizon, whispered, "I think she's happy we're back." No one responded right away. The wind ruffled the girl's hair and made the silence comfortable. Jackson picked up a small shell, handed it to Harper and said, "Let's keep this moment, not to remember what happened, but to know what we have now." It was a simple gesture, but it left a lasting impression. That night they wrote their wishes for the new year together on pieces of paper and kept them in a wooden box with a red bow. It was the beginning of a new tradition, and also the silent and affectionate end of an old cycle of absence. When they returned from their trip, something had changed forever. The girls began to call him Dad naturally, not only when they were among themselves, but also in front of their classmates, teachers, and even strangers. It was as if the bond that had been gradually formed had finally been firmly established. Jackson felt this when, at a school meeting, the principal introduced him as the girl's father, and they didn't correct him. On the contrary, they smiled, proud. For someone who had always sought recognition in numbers, that moment was worth more than any award or headline. It was discreet but complete. and it sealed the construction of something he never imagined living, a real family, imperfect, but deeply true. It was around this time that Jackson decided to move to a new apartment. He sold the minimalist loft where he had lived since he was 40 and bought an old 2-story house in a more residential neighborhood, with trees lining the sidewalk and neighbors who waved from their windows. He renovated everything with the girls. Each one got to choose the color of her room, the furniture, and the wall decals. Harper went for a petrol blue and shelves for her books. Haley chose white and gray, with a modern desk and a map board. Hannah, of course, wanted lilac fairy lights and animal-shaped pillows. Jackson got the simplest room, but he insisted on having a chair next to the bed so he could read stories with them. Charlotte continued to live in her apartment, but she kept a room there too for the weekends when they all got together. It was a new setup, out of the traditional mold, but it worked. It was alive, full of bonds, and above all, built by choice. For the first time, Jackson had a home, not just a house. On a rainy April morning, Jackson took the girls to the cemetery to visit Meredith's grave. It was the first time they had all gone together. Charlotte walked them to the entrance, but she preferred to wait in the car, giving them time for this intimate moment. The three of them walked hand in hand to the simple headstone, adorned with fresh flowers. Jackson stayed a little behind, respecting their time. Harper was the first to kneel and place a flower. Haley took a stone painted in gold paint from her pocket and placed it next to the headstone. Hannah, with tears in her eyes, leaned her head against the cold stone and whispered something that no one else could hear. Jackson watched in silence, feeling a mixture of gratitude and guilt, as if he were being officially introduced to the woman he had known in one way and who had then existed in so many other ways without him. When the girls had finished paying their respects, Harper stood up, looked at Jackson, and said in a firm but soft voice, "She would have liked to know that you came." He nodded, swallowing hard. Haley, ever objective, added, "But she would have liked even more to know that you stayed." Hannah ran to him and held his hand tightly. It was then that he approached the grave, knelt before the headstone, and took from his pocket a note he had written the night before. He read it softly. "I'm sorry I left, but I'm here now, and I'll stay here." He placed the note among the flowers, next to the golden stone. It was a silent gesture, but definitive. In that moment, Jackson was not saying goodbye to Meredith. He was acknowledging her. And more than that, he accepted that his story with her did not end in her absence, but was reborn in the love they left in the world: Harper, Haley, and Hannah. After the visit to the cemetery, something settled between them. There were no more doubts or gaps. It was as if that visit to the grave had closed a cycle that had been silently opened since the day Jackson had seen the girls for the first time at Eleanor's wake. From that moment on, their bonds grew stronger in a lighter way. Questions gave way to inside jokes, silences were filled with music and loose conversations, and even Charlotte started to play more, as if she had taken off a piece of armor from her shoulders. Jackson, now accustomed to the new routine, traded his suit and tie for linen shirts and comfortable sneakers. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to be closer to the girls' world and to himself. He discovered that he liked doing puzzles, shopping at the market on Saturdays, and losing at Uno even when he was trying to win. One afternoon, as they waited for the cake to bake, Hannah asked, "Dad, do you think Mom would like us now?" Jackson, sitting on the floor with his back against the kitchen cabinet, answered without thinking, "I think she'd be very proud." Harper, stirring the batter carefully, agreed. "She'd say, 'We're growing the right way.'" And Haley, sitting at the table, with a notebook, added, "And that you're trying the right way, too." The sentence hung in the air like a subtle confirmation. Jackson smiled and got up to check the oven, but his chest was full. It wasn't about fixing the past anymore. It was about building the present with what you have. Every gesture, every mistake, every success, it was all part of it. And as he looked at those three, he knew one thing for sure. No matter where life took him, he would never walk alone again. As the months passed, the signs that Jackson had changed were no longer internal, but reflected in the world around him. His phone no longer rang during dinner, the clock was no longer a constant enemy, and the word urgent seemed to have lost the power it had once commanded his days. The firm noticed. One of the partners even asked, half-jokingly, if he had been on a spiritual retreat. Jackson simply replied, "Sort of." He no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. His focus had shifted. The center of his life now had 3 names, 3 different laughs, and 3 unique ways of asking for attention. What had once been an impeccable career was now just part of the equation. Important, yes, but not definitive. One day, while organizing a photo album with the girls, Jackson came across a picture Charlotte had taken during their trip to the beach. They were sitting in a circle on the sand, holding hands, with the sun setting in the background. It was a simple, spontaneous photo, but it had a symbolic power that made him stop for a few minutes. "This one looks like a frame," Harper said, peeking over his shoulder. And so they did. The photo earned a place on the living room shelf, next to old frames of Meredith and the colorful drawings Hannah often made. On the frame was a discreet plaque that read, "We met at the right time." Jackson didn't know who came up with the phrase, but he never asked. Maybe it was Charlotte, maybe one of the girls, or maybe no one in particular. What mattered was that it was true. And that truth printed there reminded him daily that some stories don't have to start out right. They just have to find their way. One night, while reviewing Haley's homework, Jackson realized he knew his schoolwork better than his own financial reports. "I can't believe I'm solving fractions with different denominators at 10 o'clock at night," he said, laughing as he scribbled in her notebook. Haley rolled her eyes with the sarcasm of an 8-year-old who thinks she's an adult. "You chose this life," he said, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. And it was true. He did. Every day since that first silent meeting at the funeral, he had chosen to stay. He had chosen to learn. He had chosen to love, even through the doubts, the stumbles, the silences. This was new, unpredictable, but deeply real, and more valuable than any successful market projection. The following weekend, they had a picnic in the park. Charlotte brought apple pie. Harper made the list. Haley organized the games, and Hannah provided the soundtrack, a not-so-obvious selection of children's songs and 80s classics she'd discovered by accident. Sitting on a plaid blanket, Jackson watched the 3 of them laugh out loud, push each other up against pillows, and chase bubbles. In the midst of this, he couldn't think about anything else. Not the past, not what could have been. For the first time, he was fully present. Charlotte sat down next to him, took a piece of pie, and said, "If someone had told me a year ago that we'd be here today, I would have laughed." Jackson smiled. "If someone had told me I'd be happy sweeping cookie crumbs out of the back seat of the car, I would have laughed too." But there they were, laughing together, and that was enough. As Meredith's birthday approached, Harper suggested they do something special to honor her. "It doesn't have to be sad, it just has to be ours," she said, with that look in her eyes that says more than she thinks. They decided to write letters to their mother and bury them in the garden of their new home, next to a lavender plant that Hannah had helped plant. It was a quiet afternoon, with words written calmly and tears held back. Jackson wrote his too, not as a way of making amends, but as a way of being present. He told her how sorry he was for taking so long, how much he admired her strength in raising 3 incredible girls, and how much he would do anything to live up to the story that was now his too. When they buried the letters, Harper placed a rock on top and said, "She lives here with us now too." And they all agreed, without saying anything. After this ritual, things took on an unexpected lightness. Jackson began to see Meredith in everyday detail, in the way Hannah danced without music, in Harper's firmness when making decisions, in Haley's ability to organize chaos with colorful spreadsheets. It was as if she were there, sewn into each of them, alive in the small quirks. And the great silences, Sometimes he would catch himself looking at one of them and thinking she would laugh at that, or she would say exactly that at that moment. And instead of hurting, it comforted. It was a presence that didn't demand space, but filled it. Over time, even Meredith's photos found new places in the house, no longer just as memories, but as part of life in motion. And Jackson understood every day that building something new didn't mean erasing what was. It meant embracing all of it and moving on together. One lazy Sunday, as they watched a rerun of a movie in the living room, Hannah dozed off in Jackson's lap, one finger still clutching the hem of his shirt. It had become a regular occurrence, the three of them taking turns vying for him to cuddle, hold, or read the night story to. But today, as he felt the light weight of his sleeping daughter and listened to the low sound of the television mixed with the occasional giggles of Harper and Haley, Jackson had a simple but profound thought. If this isn't happiness, then I really don't know what is. It wasn't the kind of performative happiness he'd seen in business magazines or bank commercials. It was a raw, unfiltered joy that lived in the everyday, in the stillness, in the presence. And it was new. It was everything he hadn't known he needed until it arrived. Charlotte had commented one night that the girls were feeling more secure, more free. I think they feel like they have a place to come back to now, no matter what happens, she said as they washed the dishes together. Jackson smiled, drying a glass, and replied, "And so do I." She looked at him, surprised by his answer, but she said nothing. They both knew what that meant. Jackson was no longer a man on the run, from the past, from his feelings, from his responsibilities. Now he was here, and being a father, more than a role, had become a present tense, an ongoing act made up of mistakes and successes, but also of daily choices. And he chose, every day. He chose to stay, to listen, to learn, to start over. He chose to be the kind of man his daughters could call dad without hesitation. And maybe in the end, that was all they needed. At school, the first projects about family began to appear. One of the themes was the most important person in my life, and the three of them, without agreeing on one another, chose to write about Jackson, each in their own way. Harper talked about trust, about how she had learned that people could change too. Haley used graphs and comparisons to explain that Jackson's presence was like an equation that had finally balanced itself. And Hannah drew them all together in a park, with hearts floating in the sky and a caption written in crooked letters. "My dad is my invisible hero made real." Jackson received the three-folded sheets with a mixture of joy and astonishment. He, who thought he didn't know how to be a father, was now a role model. And not because he was perfect, but because he was there, because he chose not to run away. On Jackson's birthday, the girls had planned a surprise. They made him a breakfast with crooked pancakes, hand-drawn cards, and a video with photos and videos of moments they had shared together over the past year. It was simple, but deeply symbolic. When the video ended, Harper, speaking on behalf of the three of them, said, "We know you came later, but now you are part of what came before too." He couldn't answer. He just hugged them, feeling a lump in his throat that mixed everything: longing, joy, regret, gratitude. Charlotte, who was watching from the door with tears in her eyes, just nodded. There was nothing more to be said. That morning marked not only the passing of another year, but the certainty that the paths taken, even if crooked and late, had led to the right place, a place called home. Over time, stories from the past began to become a topic of conversation at night, between bowls of soup. The girls wanted to know how Jackson and Meredith met, why they drifted apart, what he felt when he found out he had daughters. He answered honestly, without trying to sound like a hero or a poor guy. He said he was afraid, that he made bad choices, that he spent years stuck in an idea of success that now seemed empty. But he also said that he loved their mother, the way he knew it at the time, and that now he understood what really mattered. They listened attentively. They didn't judge. They just absorbed. like someone deciphering the layers of a story that is also theirs, even if they didn't participate in the beginning. And curiously, that strengthened their bonds. By getting to know the Jackson of old, they understood the Jackson of now better. One night, after one of these conversations, Hannah asked to sleep in his room. She said she had a nightmare, and that the only way she could calm down was to hear his breathing. Jackson let her lie down next to him, covered her with the duvet, and lay there awake, watching his daughter fall asleep. That moment, so simple, struck him in an unexpected way. He remembered the time when he slept alone, surrounded by silence and cold walls, insomnia caused by meetings and unstable markets. Now, there was a tiny heart beating nearby, a cry for shelter, a trust that cannot be bought, cannot be forced. It can only be earned. He laid his head on the pillow, closed his eyes, and thought, maybe this is what being a father is all about. Being the place someone runs to when the world gets scary. And finally, he slept peacefully. Living together also brought room for conflicts, small disagreements, unexpected tantrums, arguments over schedules and chores. There was the time Haley locked herself in her room because Jackson wouldn't let her take her tablet to school. Another time, Harper didn't speak to him for 3 days after she found out he forgot to pick up some art supplies he'd promised. And Hannah, on a particularly difficult day, screamed that he wasn't real and that she wanted her mom. Jackson heard it all, and instead of responding with scolding or attempts to control her, he chose to listen. He apologized when he made mistakes, explained when he needed to, and above all, he stayed. Because, deep down, that's what mattered. He didn't have to get it right every time. He had to be consistent, show that even in the mistakes, the love was still there. These moments, as hard as they were, taught him more than any other. Jackson learned to deal with frustrations that didn't involve numbers, but feelings. He learned that raising 3 girls wasn't a spreadsheet to be organized, but rather a dance in which he needed to learn new steps all the time. And more than that, he learned to be vulnerable, to admit that he didn't know everything, that sometimes he was also afraid, that he still carried doubts and regrets. The girls, in turn, began to understand that he was human, and perhaps that was exactly what cemented the love between them, their shared imperfection. He was no longer a father who had appeared out of nowhere, but someone who, even stumbling, chose to walk with them every day. And that, in itself, was more than enough. One spring afternoon, as they were tidying up the yard to plant new flowers, Harper asked something that took Jackson by surprise. "If Mom had told you about us before, would you have come?" He was silent for a few seconds, staring at the damp earth in his hands. The answer wasn't simple. He knew that years ago he wouldn't have been the man he was today, and maybe he wouldn't have been even if he had come. So he answered honestly, "I guess I wasn't ready before. But there hasn't been a day since I found out that I don't wish I could go back in time and do things differently." Harper nodded slowly, without judgment. "It's okay. You're here now." And she smiled. That smile, more than forgiveness, was acceptance. It was confirmation that sometimes the present can, indeed, give new meaning to the past. That same night, they had an improvised dinner with what they had in the fridge: eggs, toast, fruit, and lots of laughter. Charlotte showed up unexpectedly with a simple carrot cake and said it was just because. They all sat together on the porch, barefoot and with plates on their laps. It was a banal scene, the kind that no one posts, that doesn't become a social media memory. But for Jackson, it was everything. He looked at each of the girls and felt a kind of peace he had never known. There were no goals, no achievements, just presence, the certainty of being in the right place with the right people. And even with everything that was left behind, there he was, whole, available, transformed. Maybe that was what Meredith wanted deep down, for her daughters to be loved, for him to find a way back, not to her, but to who he could have been all along. A few days later, Jackson received an envelope in the mail. It was an old letter from Meredith, sent by a Friend of hers who, according to Charlotte, had promised to keep it and only send it if Meredith ever left. The envelope was crumpled, the ink a little faded. Inside was a single sheet. Her handwriting, as always, was firm and round. "If you're reading this, it's because time has done its part," she began. She spoke without resentment, without recriminations. She said she knew him well enough to know that he would take a while, but he would arrive. She hoped, with all her heart, that he wouldn't. Let his pride keep him from getting to know his daughters. They're going to change you, and you're going to change them. Don't be surprised if you don't recognize yourself in the mirror in a while. That's a sign that something went right. Jackson read and reread it in silence. Then he put the letter in the drawer where other mementos were already. A drawing of Hannah, Harper's first note, Haley's grocery list. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Jackson stood on the porch, looking at the sky. It was clear, with few clouds and a shy moon peeking through the branches of the tree in the garden. He thought about Meredith, about what could have been, what never was, and what, in some unexpected way, ended up being. He missed her, of course, but a different kind of longing. Calm, not the kind that tears, but the kind that caresses, the kind that acknowledges. And there, in that silence punctuated only by the sound of crickets and the light wind, he murmured to himself, "Thank you for believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." It was a belated but sincere thank you, and perhaps, in the time of things that really matter, it was still exactly the right time. The following week, Jackson was invited to give a talk at a renowned university about leadership and decision-making in the financial market. It was the kind of invitation that he would have accepted with pride and prepared weeks in advance. This time, he hesitated. He asked for time to think. It was Harper who encouraged him. "You should go, just don't forget to talk about who you are now, not just who you were." That really got to him. He prepared the presentation in 2 days, and when he went on stage, in front of a packed audience, he took a deep breath before starting. He spoke about investments, yes, but also about losses, new beginnings, and the importance of being present in one's own life. He mentioned, without naming names, 3 small and big reasons that completely changed the way he saw the world. When he finished, the audience gave him a standing ovation, but what stuck with him was the text message he received right afterward. "We're proud of you. Bring in pizza?" On the way home, Jackson stopped at the girl's favorite pizza place and arrived with 2 giant boxes. He was greeted with hugs, noise, and laughter. Charlotte was on the couch, with a movie already paused on the screen. "Was the talk good?" he asked, taking a bite of a slice. "It was, but this is better," he replied, sinking into the couch with Hannah on his lap and Harper pulling up a pillow to lean against. Haley, in her own way, commented, "You spoke like a normal human being. It was beautiful," and everyone laughed. There was nothing extraordinary about that night, but for Jackson, it was another piece that fit into the puzzle of a lifetime that he thought was already complete, and that, in fact, was just beginning. One day, while sorting through old documents for filing, Jackson came across a folder with retirement plans and financial goals he had drawn up years ago. It was a detailed timeline filled with charts, predictions, and exact dates for quitting work, traveling the world, and buying a house somewhere sunny in the Mediterranean. He read each line as if reading letters from another self. It no longer made sense. It was a portrait of a man who believed that success was synonymous with emotional distance, that vulnerability was weakness, and that love required guarantees. He smiled when he realized how all that had been deconstructed, not all at once, but little by little, day by day, in the arms of his daughters, in conversations with Charlotte, in the challenges of a life together. It was as if he had gained a new compass. And now, more than goals, he wanted stories. After putting the folder in the back of the drawer, Jackson went for a walk with Harper, as they sometimes did, just the 2 of them. They walked slowly through a nearby park, talking about everything. And nothing. At one point she asked if he felt different than he did when he was younger. Totally, he replied with a half smile, but not in the important ways. I just needed time to understand what really matters. Harper, who was economical with her words, nodded with a look that was too mature for her age. We've changed too, you know, since you came along. Jackson stopped walking, looked at his daughter and replied, You've changed me. She smiled, took his hand, and they walked on, without saying anything else. And in that meaningful silence, he understood that sometimes the greatest transformation doesn't come with a fuss. It comes with slow steps, small hands, and whispered words in the middle of a walk. With Meredith's death anniversary approaching, Charlotte proposed a low-key tribute, gathering people close to her for an afternoon coffee in the garden, with photos, stories, and memories. The girls agreed immediately. Each one was in charge of something. Harper made a timeline of her mother's most memorable moments. Haley organized the photos into a slideshow with a soundtrack. Hannah wrote a letter that she read aloud to everyone, with her eyes closed, as if she were speaking directly to Meredith. Jackson, in turn, was in charge of the cake, and decided, with the help of his daughters, to make Meredith's favorite, lemon cake with condensed milk frosting. The afternoon was light and affectionate. Instead of sadness, there was presence. Instead of regret, there was gratitude. It was as if everyone there had understood that remembering is not suffering. It is continuing to love in a new way. After the guests had left, the four of them, Jackson, Harper, Haley, and Hannah, sat on the grass, still warm from the sun, and were silent for a while. Charlotte watched from the porch, a cup in her hands and a calm smile on her face. Jackson looked at his daughters, now older and more confident, and felt something settle inside him. It was no longer the fear of making mistakes, nor the guilt of the past. It was a kind of quiet peace that came from the certainty of having done what he could. Hannah touched his shoulder and asked, "Do you think she saw all this today?" Jackson didn't hesitate. "I think she saw it long before we thought of doing it." And at that moment, everyone smiled, not like someone closing a story, but like someone accepting that some stories don't close. They live on, in every choice, in every gesture, in every new memory. A few weeks later, Jackson received an unexpected invitation. One of the largest international banks wanted to appoint him to a global leadership position based in London. It was the biggest offer of his career. Prestige, $1 million salary, international recognition. Years ago, he would have accepted immediately. But now the invitation came as an uncomfortable question. Is it worth giving up all this here? He talked to Charlotte, weighed the pros and cons, did the math, analyzed scenarios. But it was in a conversation with Haley while they were washing the dishes that he got the clearest answer. "Will you go if we don't want to go?" she asked bluntly. He looked at her, foaming at the mouth, and said, "No, I'm not going." And in that moment, the decision was made, without guilt, without a doubt. He had already found his greatest achievement, and it wasn't a position, it was a presence. When he turned down the offer, Jackson felt something curious, relief. Not the relief of someone who runs away, but of someone who makes a choice with conviction. For the first time, he felt that life made sense in a different way, and that freed him. He returned to work with a lighter approach, focusing on projects that had a purpose, mentoring young professionals, and initiatives that had a social impact. But above all, he kept the most important commitment of his day, being present at home. He took the girls to school, watched their rehearsals, helped with their homework, and made sure to have Sunday lunches with a full table. The simple routine, previously ignored, was now celebrated. And as the days went by, the more Jackson understood that it was not necessary to lose everything to gain something else. Sometimes, all you had to do was learn to measure life in other units. Hugs, conversations, laughs in the middle of the afternoon. And in that, he was already an immensely successful man. A year after that silent funeral that became the starting point for Everything. Jackson woke up early, made breakfast, and wrote 3 short notes, one for each daughter, left on the plate with simple words, "Thank you for letting me be your dad." The girls found the notes minutes later and, without saying much, each reacted in their own way. Harper smiled and put the paper in her diary. Haley took a photo and put it as the background on her tablet. And Hannah stuck the note on the closet door next to hearts drawn in marker. There were no big declarations, but the love was there in its purest form, lived in the details. And for Jackson, that was enough. He didn't need applause or external recognition. He just needed to continue to be worthy of that trust that took so long to build. That night, as she closed the windows of the house, she heard laughter coming from the girls' bedroom. She peeked through the crack and saw the 3 of them lying in the same bed, watching an old video of Meredith that Charlotte had found on a flash drive. She was dancing in the living room with a big pregnant belly, laughing as she sang off-key to a pop song from the 2000s. Jackson approached slowly, and the 3 of them called him in. He sat on the floor, his back against the bed, and watched that version of the woman he had known so briefly, and who now seemed to live on in every feature of his daughters. At the end of the video, Harper rested her head on his shoulder and said, "We got lucky, huh?" He didn't answer. He just kissed the top of her head and nodded. Yes, they had gotten lucky, but they had also made choices, and that's what made it all the more special. And take the opportunity to comment below what you would do in his place. Your choices can also inspire other people who are going through something similar. A few days later, in one of the school's art classes, the teacher asked each student to draw a portrait of their own family. Hannah, as always, threw herself into the project with enthusiasm. When she finished, she proudly showed it to Charlotte, who was nearby helping the teachers. The drawing featured her, Harper, Haley, Charlotte, and Jackson, all holding hands, surrounded by flowers and hearts. Above the picture was a caption written in large, colorful letters. "Family is who chooses to stay." The teacher was moved. Charlotte hid her tears, and the drawing was put up on the school bulletin board. Jackson only found out days later when he went to pick her up and came across the picture in the hallway. He stood there for long minutes, looking at the details, trying to contain his emotion. This wasn't just a drawing. It was a milestone, a seal, a silent proof that, even though he arrived late, he had been accepted. On the way home, Jackson asked his daughter why she had written that sentence. Hannah, sitting in the back seat, responded with the naturalness of someone saying the most obvious thing in the world. Because it's true, right? Some people are family only on paper, and some people become family because they choose to love. He didn't know what to say. He just smiled in the rearview mirror and kept driving, his heart beating faster with each word that echoed in his mind. Sometimes, the greatest lessons in life come from small, sincere mouths. And at that moment, he was certain that despite the mistakes, the absences, and the wasted time, he had done the right thing. He chose to love. And more than that, he was chosen back. As the weeks went by, the routine fell into place. There were no more secrets, no hidden insecurities. That family was solid. At Sunday lunches, someone would always show up unexpectedly. A friend from school, a curious neighbor, a co-worker of Jackson's who had become part of the circle. The house was always full of voices, the sound of pots and pans, scattered toys and life, and even on the most chaotic days, when everything seemed out of control, there was a constant sense of belonging. Jackson, who had previously sought order, now found beauty in improvisation. He no longer needed to predict the future, he just had to live the present truthfully. And in that present, he was no longer just a Wall Street executive. He was the father who drove his daughters to school, who sang out of tune in the car, who knew the names of his dolls and memorized the ballet steps. One night, while tidying up the kitchen with Charlotte after a family dinner, she turned and said, "You've become what she always dreamed you would be." Jackson stopped, still holding a plate, and looked at her for a few seconds in silence. He didn't need to ask who she was talking about. He knew, Meredith. That sentence had touched him deeply, but not in a painful way. It was like a seam finally closing. He smiled and replied softly, "It took a while, but I'm here." Charlotte just nodded, her eyes shining, and continued to stack the cutlery. There was nothing more to say, because sometimes what needs to be said is already present in the look, in the gesture, in the simple fact of having stayed, and Jackson now knew the value of that, for real. Months later, on a clear Sunday, Jackson took the girls for a walk in an open field on the outskirts of town. It was a peaceful place, with old trees and wildflowers, and a hill where they could watch the sunset without a single building in the way. They climbed to the top together, carrying a basket of fruit, juice, and a blanket. When they sat down, Jackson took a small object wrapped in craft paper from his pocket. He handed it to the three of them. "I wanted you to have something to remember this year by, not for what we lost, but for what we built." It was a necklace for each of them, with a pendant in the shape of an imperfect heart, slightly asymmetrical, as if it had been molded by hand. On the back was the engraving, "You are my new beginning." The three of them opened the packages carefully, as if they knew they were receiving something more than just a gift. Harper put the necklace around her neck and said, "Now it all makes sense." Haley held the pendant tightly and smiled sideways, saying nothing. Hannah kissed Jackson on the cheek and said, in the most sincere tone imaginable, "Thank you for coming." They stood there until the sun disappeared completely, in silence, with their arms intertwined. There were no more questions, no pending issues, just a clear feeling that, despite everything, they were exactly where they were supposed to be. As they drove home, Jackson glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the three of them asleep in the back seat, their necklaces hanging over their coats. And for the first time since Eleanor had left, he didn't feel that hollow feeling in his chest. He felt complete. He felt peace. He had lost a life and gained another. One he hadn't planned, one he hadn't foreseen, but one that deep down was perhaps the only one that had ever mattered. And as he parked the car, he whispered to himself with a barely perceptible smile, "This time I stayed. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and activate the bell to receive each new story as soon as it comes out."